So there are good long-term studies of children with gender dysphoria. Most of them were conducted in Toronto, where I happen to be, by a man named Ken Zucker. And Zucker ran a clinic for gender dysphoric kids way before this became part of the culture war, let's say. And he was a very straight and honest scientist, a very good researcher, not a political person. And what he showed was, what his clinic showed, many peer-reviewed studies, was that gender dysphoria of the type that you described is relatively rare. But if you leave kids alone till they're 19 or 18, 80 to 90% of them settle into their biological identity. Although about 80% of them are also homosexual in their orientation. And so the pathway for him, before this was all politicized, was you'd have a child who was gender nonconforming temperamentally, somewhat like you were. You didn't have a pattern of female interests, let's say. And then prone to depression and anxiety, and then that combination would produce this gender dysphoria, and that would become quite intense around the dawn of puberty. But if you just backed the hell off and waited, those kids would settle into their body, but generally adopt a homosexual orientation. And so that was, as far as I could tell, that was the best research. Now, Zucker got slaughtered for this once it became politicized. He lost his job. He was pilloried by the Toronto Star, the newspaper here. He won a lawsuit against them just a couple of years ago, but they demolished his career. And his guideline medically was, don't do any harm, right? Back the hell off. You can provide these kids with support and you can walk them through their emotional problems, but you should certainly not rush into anything more dramatic. Now, you said you started therapy when you were 12.
I would also start seeing a lot of feminist content at this time, which kind of reinforced those same ideas while also saying things that were pretty scary to me at the time, like, oh, we live under a patriarchy. We're being controlled by men and they don't care about us. They're taking away our rights. And, you know, I don't believe that now, of course, but I kind of fell into that line of thinking. And with all this, I just wanted absolutely nothing to do with being a woman. I didn't want to grow into a woman. Why would I?
Women are evaluated more rigorously on the basis of their physical appearance than men. Men are evaluated more harshly, sexually, let's say, on the performance side, with regard to socioeconomic status and so forth. But women are definitely evaluated more harshly by men and by each other in terms of their physical attractiveness. So that makes quite a complicated situation for girls who are making the transition into puberty, and a lot of them are depressed and anxious and develop an intense focus on their bodies. Young women who are confused about their sexual identity and their body might be wondering is, well, now and then I feel an attraction to another girl. What does that mean? Does that mean that I'm not, female in my essence, I'm not female physiologically, I'm not female psychologically? And I would say, no, it doesn't mean that at all. It's pretty damn common. It might even be the norm. And I think most women would, when pushed, would make the same statement that you just made about their relative sexual attraction. You said that, as far as I can tell so far, you said your therapist accepted the idea that you should be a boy pretty damn rapidly. I should also point out to everyone who's listening, that's actually now mandatory by law. So in many jurisdictions. So now, because of standards of gender-affirming care, therapists are required, if you say something like you're a girl, you say something like, well, I'm a boy, the therapist is now required to agree with you on pain of license loss. So beware, everyone listening and watching, because that's now the law in many places. And so to me, that's the end of psychotherapy, because all psychotherapy is a questioning approach fundamentally, to find out what the problem is and then to try to work towards, well, first of all, non-harmful solutions.
They told them that, this is pretty much the only means of treating dysphoria. There was no regards to any alternative treatments. You know, my dad asked like about the regret rates, and they said like, oh, they didn't even. I don't think they even used the word detransition. They said like, oh, there's less than a 1% to 2% regret rate, and they also told my parents that if I wasn't allowed to go through with this, then I would be at risk of suicide.
Okay, so I want to take all of that apart, okay? Because every single one of those statements is a lie. So first of all, the American Psychological Association in their guidelines for gender-affirming treatment makes the case that, and because of prejudice, that there are no good long-term follow-up studies of transgender individuals. Okay, and they attribute that to prejudice against transgender individuals, which is not the reason, by the way. The reason is that there's a very low base rate, or there was, of transgender dysphoria, and the follow-up studies haven't been done in large part because the surgical and hormonal treatment regimen is relatively new. But there are no good long-term follow-up studies, and they actually complain about that. And then a couple pages later in the same document, they say that, well, it's necessary to affirm an alternate gender identity because otherwise the client or patient is at heightened risk of suicide. Okay, so first of all, both of those things can't be true. There's no way that people can know that suicide risk is elevated if gender transition is delayed unless the long-term studies are in place. And they already stated that the bloody long-term studies aren't in place. So that's all just a lie, but it's worse than that. It's way worse than that. You see, gender dysphoria is a variant of the suffering that's associated with negative emotion, depression and anxiety. Now, depression and anxiety are the primary drivers of suicidal ideation, not gender dysphoria per se. And so they're confusing the source. Now and then there is no evidence whatsoever that transition of the medical sort actually has a salutary effect on mental health, partly because the long-term studies simply haven't been done. And the idea that we actually know from a research perspective that a child is much safer if they start transition than they are if they don't. That's simply not true. Ken Zucker's work has showed quite clearly that if you just leave the kids alone, then by the time they're 18 or 19, most of them settle into their biological identities. Now, so the reason I'm stressing this is because your parents, like many parents in this situation, were put in a very, very difficult position. And I would say it's corrupt to the point of malevolence, what the medical professionals are doing on this front. And that is the insistence, well, would you rather have a live trans child or a dead child? Which is, I don't think there's anything more toxic you can say to a parent than that, because that backs them into a corner. Because their alternatives are then, well, you can let your child go ahead with this absolutely life-altering hormonal and then surgical treatment, or your child can die, and it's your fault because you don't care enough. And parents, they're accustomed to trusting their medical professionals, at least to some degree, and accustomed to assuming that the knowledge they put forward is valid and reliable. And the information that your family was given was none of those. In fact, it's pathological to a degree that's almost imaginable. It's criminal, in my estimation, what you were told. Because there is simply no evidence that any of that is the case. There's no evidence that transitioning kids are less likely to be suicidal. There's no evidence that that's the only treatment path that works. And there's certainly no evidence that there's no alternative to transition or suicide. It's so pathological, I can't believe it, but it's no wonder your parents were pushed into a corner, because that's a dreadful choice for a parent to have to make.